Good morning and welcome to the second virtual study day of 2018. You didn't think we'd let you down, did you? Well, we have battled through the snow to get here, and I'm sorry we're a little bit late in starting. I think some snowballs have got into the equipment somewhere. But we are here and ready and here for the next 2 hours with some really, I hope, exciting sessions for our crime criminology students and for our policing investigation students and for anyone else who might be interested in what we're talking about today. We've got some live sessions and some pre-recorded sessions that I hope will be really useful for you. We've got Becky Milne coming in later on to talk about investigations and interviewing and the importance of communication. Mark Jacobs and I are going to be talking about the development of radical criminology. We're going to start off with a chat about dissertations with Craig Colley. But before that, we want you to get involved. So if you can, please ask your questions, post your comments and your feedback to us. You might need to create a channel, but that shouldn't take you a minute. You just have to click on your avatar, create a studio, pick a name, and then you should be away. And we'd also like to see where you are today as well, watching the virtual study day. So please, if you can, take a photo of yourself watching the study day, preferably with some snow in the background as well, and send it to us via Twitter, Facebook or Instagram with the hashtag ICJS VSD18. That's ICJS VSD18. We'll look through those a little later on, and the best one will be winning a prize. So please do join in as much as you can. We'd really love to hear from you. So back to the programme, and we're going to start off with a chat about dissertations. And I'm joined on the sofa by Craig Colley, who is a senior lecturer at ICJS. And we're going to be talking a little bit about dissertations, how they work, how you structure them. We're swapping it around a bit, so Craig is going to be interviewing me and asking me all the difficult questions. So, over to you, Craig.
Hey, morning, Sarah. Morning, everybody. Good to be here. First question I've got for you. Okay, so you've got your nice idea, you know what you want to do for your dissertation, but how do you take that and turn it into a research question?
And that, as you know, Craig, can be the tricky part, isn't it? Because students will say, well, I'm interested in doing this particular topic about whatever it might be, and it's usually far too broad to go into a dissertation. Students are often worried that they won't be able to find enough literature or enough to write about in a 10,000 word dissertation at undergraduate level. But as we know, you really can. So it's really important to focus in and narrow in as far as possible when you're thinking about your idea. So you've got your idea, which might be, I want to look at what the public think of the police. But that's quite broad, isn't it? So you want to narrow that down, really focus it, maybe add in some variables as well. So you might, rather than looking at generally what the public think of the police, you might want to look at age groups. So do younger people have higher impressions of the police or better impressions of the police than older people, for example? You know, that's not true. So you might want to add in a variable, look perhaps at the types of people as well, because what we know is that people who contact the police have a better impression of them than those that the police contact them. So add a variable in, narrow it down, and think about a specific area, I think, that you're interested in. I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, that chimes with my experience of these things quite well. Tends to be the narrower the better, as you mentioned, because what quickly happens is if you go too broad, you realise you've got way too much to talk about, and when you've got too much, it becomes a bit descriptive, and at this level, we want something that's a little bit more in depth.
Absolutely.
And when it's narrow like that, you can really get that depth and really respond to that question, and it also helps it flow better, which is a big thing for me, is how it flows.
That's interesting that you say that about description, because that's absolutely right. Because when you're writing a dissertation, you have to imagine that your reader is a sort of intelligent teenager rather than a subject expert. So you have to explain everything first, don't you, in a dissertation, before you can get to the actual brunt of what you're looking at. Yeah. So if you're doing a vast, enormous topic, you'll spend 10,000 words just describing the situation. Right?
Yeah, definitely. 10,000 words really seems like a big, intimidating, huge number to start with. But when you get going, especially if it's something that you're really interested in, and a lot of these topics are huge, you could write a book about them.
Absolutely.
So narrowing it down is really important, and you'll use up that word count really quickly. Even the introduction, where you're just explaining what you're going to do, can easily become 1,000 words incredibly quickly.
It's funny, the 10,000 word thing, isn't it? Because that's what often worries students the most, is writing a 10,000 word piece of work. But then I always say to them, 2 months before you're handing it in, you'll have 15,000 words, most of you, and be panicking about how to cut it down. So it's never about trying to get to 10,000, is it? It's always about how to bring it down
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I've had any students who've struggled with the word count once they've gotten going with it.
Yeah.
I really agree on that point about adding in variables. The way I talk about them to students is I call them a hook.
Yes.
It's something that we're not looking for it to be completely 100% original, but adding that little difference makes it more interesting for you, it makes it more interesting for the reader, and it gives you that something to latch onto, that hook that you can keep referring back to and saying why it's different, why it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good analogy to use that as a hook. That's good.
Yeah, it's always the way I've thought of it.
Yeah.
And I found students seem to understand that. I hope it's useful for you guys. Okay. Anything else you want to talk about the research question?
No, I think that probably covers that one.
Okay, good. Really important research question. Okay, so the next thing is, what are the different types of dissertation that you can do? There's a few ways of approaching it, aren't there?
Lots of different ways. And I think importantly, no one way of researching a dissertation is better than another way. I think sometimes students think that they have to go and do some primary research, they have to go and send out a questionnaire to people or elicit people's views, and that they don't have to do that. There are different ways of researching for your dissertation. Each are equally as valid as others. So to give some examples, first of all, yes, there's primary research. So you can, if you want, go and interview people. You can use survey questionnaires to ask people their views on particular things to find out more information that way. If you are doing that, obviously you need to get ethical approval before you do it, which is really important. But that's one way to do it. Secondary research is another way, which is using data that's already out there and analysing it perhaps in a different way. So perhaps looking at some already published statistics and trying to look really in depth at a particular part of it or a particular aspect of it. There's also case study research, which not many of our students use, and I always think that's a shame really, because you can get some really quite interesting in-depth work by looking at case studies. I had a student once who was doing something on situational crime prevention, and she did a case study of drug mules in Jamaica and the use of ion detectors in airports to try to stop people from going through airports with drugs. So her dissertation as a whole was on situational crime prevention, but she had this one chapter which was a case study of what had happened in one country to try and prevent that crime, which was really interesting actually. And then the last one I would say is a literature review, which is a real in-depth look at a particular aspect of the literature, perhaps analysing it in a new way, considering a different type of research question, but not going out and doing primary research, just concentrating on what's already been published. Are there any others?
Those are the main ones.
Yeah.
You can sort of combine some of those in ways. It's probably better to focus on something, but if you feel the need to adding a case study approach to something else, I've found some students have had success with that, so it's in a chapter in addition to maybe some secondary analysis. But those are the main ones. Like you say, there's that temptation almost, that you feel like maybe feeling pushed towards primary research. Really think about whether it's going to add to what you're doing would be my advice, because I've seen some where they've gone and done primary research and it's not really made it that much more interesting than if they'd done something more literature based or used secondary information. So it's something to really consider. I mean, it can be fun and exciting, but at the same time it can also be logistically an issue. You need to think about your timings and all that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
I've also seen some really good secondary data ones that you transform that information almost, and that's quite an exciting thing. Okay, so those are the main types of dissertation. Okay, so you've started writing, you're trying to put a plan together. How do you lay out your dissertation? How do you structure it?
This is really important, getting the structure right, and it's really important to work with your supervisor on this, to work out a plan of how many chapters you're going to have, usually 3, 4, probably maximum 5. What's going to be the content of those chapters and how they're going to be different from one another. So it's really important to work on that with your supervisor. But I think we're going to play a game on how to structure a dissertation.
Yes, we are.
The idea behind this is to show, I don't know what's written on those cards, but I know that they're dissertation titles. The idea is to show that often dissertations will follow a similar pattern. So on the spot, I am going to create a dissertation title.
Okay, so the first one we've got is A Relic from History, a critical discussion of the relevance and effectiveness of the jury system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
A critical discussion of the relevance and effectiveness of the jury system. Okay. So you've got two different things there, relevance and effectiveness, which is good. I would probably think about a 3-chapter structure for this one. I think in the first chapter I would probably look at the history of the juries, history of jury service in the UK and the jury system in the UK, if it was going to be in the UK based. I think in the second chapter I would look in depth at some of the literature on how effective the jury is, and probably in a third chapter I would look to the future about what other countries perhaps do with their jury systems, the modern problems of the jury system, for example, things like social media and people being able to look back at the history of offenders, and I would probably focus forward in that final third chapter. So the aim of a dissertation is to, when you're structuring it, is to start off quite broad, and I was doing that there by looking at the kind of history of the jury system, narrowing it in the middle, looking at effectiveness, and then broadening it out again to sort of look to the future. That's probably what I would do.
Yeah.
I don't think we've got much time left, actually, Craig, so I think we'll do one more of these, and then we'll get on to some other questions.
Sure thing. I'll try and find a good one. Oh, this was a good one. Social workers or crime fighters, an examination of the views of senior leaders and frontline police officers in a mid-sized force.
Ah, okay. So this one is looking at the role of the police and the views of senior leaders and frontline police officers. So this is quite a big topic, actually. It's quite a tricky one. I think what you would have to do there is have a first chapter on the role of the police, what the police are there for, what we think the police are there for. Probably a second chapter would be looking at methodology, and third chapter would be looking at the results of the survey that's no doubt being done, or the interviews that are being done. And the fourth one would be an analysis of the results that the student has found out in comparison with the literature review that they did at the start. So bringing it all together in that final fourth chapter. But again, that's about all about working with the supervisor to do that.
Yeah, so that leads us to the next question.
Yeah.
What can you expect from your supervisor? What's their role?
The role of the supervisor is there for advice, particularly at the early stages. That's so important, that they're there to help you with the ethical issues, that they're there to help you with the planning of the surveys, if you're doing that, or the interviews, that they're there to help you plan the structure of the dissertation, and importantly to read those draft chapters when they get completed and provide overall advice about how it all links together. So what we want to see from students is a real clear structure to the dissertation. We want to see a beautiful thread that's going all the way through, clear aims and objectives that are mentioned throughout the dissertation, and a really nice punchy conclusion at the end, because sometimes, I don't know if your experience, but sometimes it can just dribble off again at the end, and what you want is something really powerful at the end.
It can happen. Yeah, the big thing for me is this flow, this sense of progression throughout the whole thing. I find that really important, and bringing it all together is a big thing at the end, because it can be a bit chapter.
Absolutely.
You want them to flow nicely.
Yeah, because you can have 4 clear chapters, can't you? But then the job at the end of the process for the student is about tying it all together, making sure it flows, making sure there's signposts between each chapters.
That's
so
huge.
You remind your reader, who's had to read 10,000 words, what's come before, what's coming later, so that you guide them through.
Yeah, because you know what's happening, but your reader might forget.
Brilliant.
Okay,
thank you so much, Craig. I think that's all we've got time for now. So thank you very much for that advice, and good luck to all of our students when they're writing their dissertations. And do come to us and your supervisors for help. Now, writing and improving your essay writing skills is a key part of the development of our undergraduate students. What we have now for you is a conversation between myself and Gordon Scruton, our learning support tutor, about some of the tips and tricks in writing better. Hello, and we're joined now by Gordon Scruton, who is the learning support tutor for ICJS. And Gordon and I are going to talk now a little bit about writing better essays. And we're particularly focusing this on level 4 students and perhaps level 5 students as well. So students in the earlier stages of their academic careers. We're going to be talking a little bit about how you can write better essays. So welcome, Gordon.
Hi, Sarah.
Gordon thinks we're going to be just having a nice relaxed chat about writing better essays.
That was what I was told, yes. Yeah.
But actually, we're going to be looking at my top 3 things that markers are looking for. Now, it may well be that these top 3 things are not quite the same as other markers' top 3 things. All markers have particular things that they're looking out for in their essays. But these are 3 things that I find myself writing a lot on feedback.
Okay, this is quite interesting because I'm not a marker and you are. And one of the things I have to keep on telling the student, well, keep on telling students, but one of the things I have to make clear to the students is that while I can help them with the various aspects of style of writing and structured writing, that sort of thing, I don't have that sense of exactly what is it that these markers are in particular going. What is it that's going to annoy them, or what is it that's going to please them? And of course, I suppose that's different for each marker to some extent.
To some extent,
but there are, what I can tell a lot of students is that there's a lot of more transferability than they think between the marks from one assignment to another.
Absolutely.
So it's actually, there's a lot that can be learned.
Yeah. So this might be quite useful then, because we've got the tutor's view and we've got the marker's view as well. So let's start off with my number one thing that I'm looking for in essays. Yes, please. And the first one is use more evidence.
Oh, okay. What's the problem that you tend to see?
What I found particularly with essays in the early stages is that students are coming up with lots of interesting points, some of which may be based on their experience in their workplace, some of which they might think are common sense ideas, but they're not backing up those points with the correct type of evidence. Sometimes they might be using some limited evidence, but perhaps not good quality evidence, but there's not enough evidence to support the points they're making. That's not to say that the points aren't right, because they very often are. But in an academic essay, you need to be supporting it with proper good quality evidence.
Okay, so here's my next question. So how do you define good quality evidence?
Well, I'd avoid tabloid newspapers. I always think there's
in all aspects of life, really. But
there's almost a hierarchy, I think, of academic references. And I would say at the top would be your peer-reviewed journal articles, and then things go down. You can use newspapers; that's absolutely fine. But be careful the types of newspapers and whether you're looking at a comments section editorial or whether you're basing it on a factual story.
I suppose you mentioned the peer review article. I'm not entirely sure that all students don't immediately understand what peer review means and why we treasure it so much. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Well, just to go for some really nice top quality journal articles in things like the Howard Journal of Criminal Justice or the British Journal of Criminology or Policing in Society, for example, where all of the articles have gone through a process of independent, anonymised review. So I could, for example, write something for a police magazine and nobody would look at it before it was published, and I could be saying things that are, stretching the truth a little bit. But if you write for an academic journal that is reviewed, then it will not get published unless it has been approved almost by other academics in the
field. And it goes through.
So when I'm putting that as my top of my hierarchy, I'm not necessarily saying that should be something that level 4 students are looking at, because I think level 4 students quite rightly will concentrate on textbooks and concentrate on things that are written in a bit more of a straightforward style, which is fine. But as students progress, then obviously look at those journal articles if possible. I also just be a bit careful about, I always say to students, about organisational documentation. Whenever I ask students to write a history of the police, I will often get people that have used the Metropolitan Police Service's version of the history of the police from their website, which is quite different to how other historians see the development of the police, because you don't necessarily see any of the controversies or difficulties.
No, it wouldn't be great for their marketing if they were putting those sorts of things on their website.
Absolutely, but in terms of your academic essay, then you need to be a bit more discerning about the types of evidence you're using. So that would be my top one. Use more evidence and better evidence, I suppose, but certainly use more evidence to support the points that you're making. Right, my second one.
Second point.
You'll like this one. A very clear introduction and structure.
Okay. I know why this is important, but I'd be very interested to hear, what is it that the clear introduction gives you as a marker?
An idea of what's coming next. Just as I did when we started this chat, and I told the audience what we were going to be doing, and the audience can think, okay, that's interesting, I'll look forward to this, or not, switch off. At the beginning of the essay, as a marker, I want to know what's coming. I don't want that to be a surprise.
No, it's not fiction, it's not the next Harry Potter or whatever. And I tend to call that the train announcement. It's like it's the if you saw the essay as the train, if you're getting on a train and nobody tells you where it's going and where it's stopping at, you're going to feel quite uncomfortable.
Brilliant, yes.
And the markers feel the same way. My understanding is the markers feel the same ways when they are starting an essay and it just kind of jumps in at, you know, immediately talking about theory, or immediately giving a whole bunch of statistics, and there's not been that broader outline about why you're going to be reading this. Also, I mean, there are practical considerations. When you're doing marking of one essay, it's not one essay, it's 40, 50, 60 essays, and you might have 2 or 3 units that you're having to mark at the same time. So there is a point where you're going to be, okay, which one is this again? And you know, the markers need that 1 or 2 lines to just kind of locate them within the world of criminology, to figure out, you know, what are we talking about in this particular piece of work.
And I think it's a good discipline for students as well, because I think if they've written in their introduction how they're going to approach the essay, that automatically leads to a better structure, because it's structuring it in their own head as well. Yeah. And I think if they say, I'm going to deal with this, I'm going to deal with this, and I'll finish with this, then that tends to follow. Yes,
I mean, I think there's a caveat to that, because I generally I tend to tell students that any introduction they write at the beginning, if the introduction is the first thing they're going to write, then it's always got brackets around it. It's always going to be a placeholder. Because I've never really successfully, I don't know about you, I've never managed to successfully write what I intended to write.
Oh no.
And so either I don't bother with an introduction at all, because sometimes you just got to start writing, you know, main bits, and you figure out how they fit together later.
Yes.
Or you have a broad idea of what you want to write, and you'd write that sort of introduction, but then the process of writing the main body means that by the time you've finished, it does not reflect what the introduction said, and you've got to go back and.
Absolutely.
But a lot of the students get this idea because we read the introduction first, we have to write the introduction first.
No, I will always write my introduction at the end.
Yeah.
And I think if I was doing a top, I might in fact move that one.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And the last one is to reference fully within the essay.
Oh yes, referencing. Yes, that's.
I didn't really want to talk about referencing, to be honest, because I think sometimes newer students can get a bit fixated about referencing.
They definitely get
being the only thing that matters in the essay.
Yeah.
Where actually we're quite interested in the content and the quality of what's written.
Yeah.
But while I think they might fixate on the reference list, I think they worry less about the referencing within the essay, and that's where I often see the problem. So they do it beautifully at the end with the commas and the full stops and the italics in the right place, but then they don't really reference fully within the essay. So they might once in a while put the name and the date in, but then they won't mention it again for another 2 or 3 paragraphs, even though it's clear that they're continuing to use the ideas of that author.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the problems kind of will stem from not realising that the in-text citations are specific to the sentence they're in, and you can't put a citation at the end of the paragraph, and it just applies to the whole paragraph. I mean, I've got mixed feelings about referencing, because it is so it is important, and it's almost but it's kind of like when you're you know, when you're like selling a house or something, and you have to make sure that all the rooms are tidy and everything looks good for the viewings, but nobody actually cares about your furniture in terms of buying the house. But it's the impression that it gives. So have the references been done correctly? Have the citations been done correctly? Because that gives the impression. That certainly gives me the impression, probably the markers as well. Has this student paid attention to making sure that they're submitting a good quality piece of work?
Yes, absolutely. And if the referencing doesn't work in those early essays at level 4, it doesn't matter. Hopefully the marker will give some advice, or will point them in your direction, and then we can work on those issues, because they're technical issues that in a sense are quite easy to fit. Because I think what would be quite useful now is if we went on to another aspect of writing better essays, which is when people perhaps get feedback that's not great, and then we suggest that they come and see you. What do people tend to come and see you about, and what can they come and see you about, importantly?
I think one of the things that they come to see me about quite a bit is to have a bit of a moan about the marking, and maybe the expectations of the marker as they've seen it. So a lot of the students will see, I think it's quite common that the markers will give, you could have included this more, you needed to discuss this more, you needed to ask a bit more about this, whatever. And the student then comes to me and says, how? I did not have enough space for that.
Okay.
Now, I only had 2,000 words. How are they expecting me to put this, and this in? You know, I was already at the maximum of 2,000 plus my 10%. And then we start picking apart their writing, what I tend to see a lot of is inefficient writing, where they've spent 20 words explaining a 10-word idea. So, you know, something like this essay's broad aim is to consider whether, and why can't we just put a line to it and just say this essay considers? And you know, that's a relatively simple example, but when you start to consider all the different places, if you could take a few words out of every sentence and condense, and it improves the flow of the writing, it makes the reading experience for the marker that much more pleasurable, and it buys them back so many words that they can probably include a new idea, which will give them more marks than just having achieved the word count. So that's...
And I think students don't need to try and cover everything, do they? I mean, if you think about an essay as including sort of 2 or 3 main points that they want to get across.
Well, I mean, that's something I probably want to put on here, would be answering the question.
Yes.
Did they answer the question?
Yes.
And the number of times when you can kind of pick out, or certainly students I see, we can, you know, look at a paragraph that's had quite a few marks, a few comments from the marker, and then the underlying issue, when we start to break it apart, is look at this paragraph, look at that question. Does this really answer that? Does this have much of a connection to that? And more often than not, it's like, not really. Maybe some of the ideas in there could be connected, but they're not being connected particularly clearly.
Yes.
But it is very easy, certainly when you're not very experienced with writing essays. It's very easy to go off on a tangent.
But you're right, addressing the question is absolutely central, and breaking the question down as well. So if you can see that the question is asking you to do 2 different things, then you need to be a little bit mathematical about it, don't you? Think, well, I need to probably think about half my essay dealing with this and half my essay dealing with that issue, and getting to the question a bit more quickly, rather than thinking, well, my essay is on current methods of neighbourhood policing. You don't have to talk through the entire history of neighbourhood policing.
Since the dawn of time. The number of essays
in order
do
to
that.
get to that point, and you can do another thing I often tell students to do is reference off, which is to say, you know, the history of neighbourhood policing is very interesting, and more can be learned about it here.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And you put C, and you list 2 or 3 sources where that history is covered. What that does is say, I am aware of the history of neighbourhood policing. I've read it.
Yes.
You often read it because I'm focusing on the question, which is on current issues around that.
It also gives I think gives a confidence to the marker that the student has read it, and that whoever's reading it, I know that the writer of this essay has a broad understanding, has contextual understanding.
Absolutely.
They're not necessarily displaying it in the writing specifically, but
they're showing awareness of it.
They're showing awareness
Brilliant,
of it, and that's really important.
Well, that's been really useful, Gordon.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I hope it's been useful to our students as well. So just some of the early things that Marcus and Gordon are coming across. And as we always say, if you are having any difficulties with your essays, if you're not clear about your feedback, then do get in touch with Gordon and he can help you out with that. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And welcome back. And we're joined on the sofa now by Professor Becky Milne. And we're going to be talking a little bit about issues in policing, particularly around interviewing and investigation. So, Becky, what I want to start off by talking about is what makes a good investigator and what is the evidence in that area?
Okay, what makes a good investigator? Well, if you read the books, in the past, what you'll find is things like they have a nose for the job, that it's inherent, that you're born with being a good detective. However, when you start looking at the literature, which is later on, and when you start looking at the research evidence, then it actually gets a bit more complicated. Is it a skill? Is it behaviour? Is it something you're born with? Can everyone do it? So we did some research in the UK with someone called Martin O'Neill. he did his PhD with me looking at what makes a good investigator in the UK, but we also did similar research in Australia to make sure it happened somewhere else too.
Yes.
With other people, other colleagues in Australia, Professor Mark Kebbell and Dr. Nina Westerer. And we looked at what makes a good investigator. So we looked at a number of measures. Is it personality? Is it IQ levels? Is it their ability to communicate? Is it what we call the big 5 personality measures? And what came out in the UK was being a good communicator. I know, I thought, because obviously my area is always interviewing, I thought, oh, let's look at another area, investigation. Communication came out again. So it quite surprised us, to be honest. We thought other things, flexibility, attention to detail, because we know obviously being a good investigator is going through, you know, minutiae, detail, time and time again. But no, communication came out. So we thought, right, try it in Australia. Same thing happened in Oz. Yeah, that being a good communicator equates to be good investigators.
That's really interesting, because the research that I've just been doing, which has not been looking at investigation at all,
Yeah.
but it's been looking at frontline cops,
Yeah.
and I've said to them, what's the most important skill that you've got as an officer? Is it authoritativeness? Is it physical
Yeah.
strength? And they've all said it's communication.
I know.
Because that's the most important tool as a police officer
Yeah.
that you've got in your armoury.
Exactly, especially in Britain when we're not armed.
Yes.
Yeah, and obviously one of my PhD students has been looking at frontline communication and what makes a good communicator, and body-worn footage is our actual dream.
Yes.
Because we can view it. So my poor PhD student, this is what doing a PhD is like, guys, is 9 months worth of footage. So he's been sitting there viewing that footage, and we've been assessing all the behaviours. Well, he's been assessing, love him, Gary Dalton, all the behaviours, what makes a good investigator at the front line. And again, we're seeing brilliant resolution at the front line, great resolution. You know, police officers doing a fantastic job in difficult situations. But we're also looking at their communication skills and need some form of improvement. They haven't got the investigative hat on. And so therefore, obviously, it could be an investigative and evidential tool, what's on that footage. And we're seeing, you know, very poor questioning, because we're trying to make them do too much. So because of that research in the UK, in fact, we then did some lab-based research. We saw a real-world problem, i.e. frontline officers having difficulty communicating, which is not contaminating me and my memory. My memory is my snow. You know, you wake up in the morning, field of white virginal snow. What happens to that snow? If you start walking on it, it gets contaminated. Me and my head scene.
Yes.
And so we went to the lab, came up with something called a structured interview protocol. Lorraine Hope and Fiona Gabbert. Fiona Gabbert at Goldsmiths led that research project, actually speaking at the evidence conference on it this week.
Yes.
And found something in the lab, and then there was randomised control trials across the country, and now it's an evidential project.
Excellent.
Yeah, so yeah, communication at the front line, key.
Yeah. So let's narrow it down a little bit in the investigation and look at the interviewer themselves.
Yes.
What makes a good interviewer?
Very interesting question. After 25 years nearly of research in this area, as you know, what makes a good interviewer? From all our research, we haven't got the key answer yet, but from all our research, I think it's something called emotional intelligence. So I've just written a couple of papers on that with someone called Patrick Risen, did his PhD with me from Norway, University Police College in Norway. And emotional intelligence, that ability to understand how you, as the questioner, can impact on the interviewee rather than looking at the interviewee themselves.
Okay.
So the actual what makes what we call the X factor of interviewing, is, we think, internal. And we can then hone it perhaps through training, but emotional intelligence. So our next phase of our 20 odd years of research is looking exactly what is that X factor of interviewing.
And so what can the organisation do to try to not only create, but then also to develop and nurture these good investigative and interviewing skills? What can they do to support people?
I've obviously worked with the UK police for 20 years looking at that very question. How do we create good investigative interviewers. There's some wonderful work going on with the United Nations at the moment, creating international standards of investigative interviewing, which I've had a little part with. The Norwegian police are leading that. Asbjørn, Ashlu and Ivar Farsing, they've been leading on that, and I've done a little bit to help out. And I'm also working with about 15 countries at the moment who all ask me the same question. How do we make good interviewers and good investigators? And so what Andy Griffiths, a PhD student of mine, Dr. Andy Griffiths now, and I have come up with is basically a framework for investigative transformation.
Okay.
And it can be for framework for investigative transformation for interviewers, or it actually could be ID inspectors. Actually, it doesn't actually matter. It's if we're trying to train officers to do something. Obviously, our field is primarily investigative interviewing, because that's my love and my passion. So this framework for investigative transformation, or FIT, has 8 fit factors.
Okay.
Right? So an organisation needs 8 fit factors to create good interviewers and good investigators.
Okay. Go on then, number 1.
Number one is a want to change.
Okay. Which is so important organisationally.
Yeah, and you know, same with the UN. So I had a country come to me recently, and they said, Becky, you came to us 8 years ago. You gave a talk about miscarriages. We're now ready to change. It's taken them 8 years to cognitively process that want to change. And miscarriages are what we are really good fuel for change. So when we see a miscarriage, we can actually utilise it to our advantage. And so whether the country or the organisation wants to change, or are, you know, forced to change because society reasons, but it's that initial, that need to change. But we need leadership to help that change.
To facilitate the change,
Exactly. You know, when I go to countries and organisations say, Becky, you know, they're not telling us, not helping us from the top. I said, you need a bottom and a top approach. Because they all blame each other. So the top will go, oh, well, they don't want it at the grassroots. And the bottom say, we're not being helped at the top. So when we go to a new organisation, new country, you say, right, I tend to do SIO, sort of, and meetings with the top. And then obviously I'll do a huge whole lecture. So I've just been in the Netherlands 4 times in the last year and a half. So I had meetings with judges in the Netherlands. So I did some training with the judges, because obviously they do a lot of decision making because of obviously inquisitorial system. But also I had 300 detectives, and I've done that 3 or 4 times with different regions of the Netherlands to get them into the idea and the ideology of what this new way of interviewing is.
Okay.
So it's that
so
sort of
organisational willingness, it's leadership. What are the other factors?
Okay, so that's 1. Fit factor 1 is a want to change with leadership. 2 is the mindset, or the cognitive mindset. So in the past, with miscarriages, it was all about interrogation, all about getting a confession or a cough. And if that is your main goal of an investigation, you know, you get your cough, job done. So in Britain, obviously, we've had many miscarriages, and we've learnt from our miscarriages, you know, from the 1970 Life on Mars through to the 80s. PACE came in. Then came in, still we haven't got good interviewers even after PACE. So that's fit factor 3. Legislation. We need a legislative, God, I can't even say it, legislative framework. That wasn't enough. Then we had another Royal Commission, and then we had what we call an interview training framework. So I'll talk about those 3. So looking at our history, so we have learnt from our mistakes. That's one thing that differentiates us in Britain compared to the rest of the world.
Learning from mistakes.
Learning from mistakes. We don't put our head in the sand. We actually, if we make an error, we go, okay, how can we stop that happening again? So I think that's what differentiates us, for example, America. America is a really good comparison, guys. If you want to do an essay, if you want to look at it, comparative analysis, UK, America, worlds apart.
Okay.
You know, it's now Trump. You know, it is worlds apart. So we needed so in Britain, when we started realising we needed some form of change because of our miscarriages and all our lovely media around it, you know, guys spent 10 hellish years in prison, you know, and then found to be innocent. First thing was, okay, to put in some legislation safeguards, and that was our Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which a lot of countries are really, really jealous of. And so the UN are putting in safeguards, some similar to our PACE. And I love going to countries. Now, we've had it Since 1984. It's not like 2 years ago. They go, what, since 84? So one key thing, think of what miscarriage is. So miscarriage is all about, turn it round, what's justice? Justice is about process and product. If you've got faulty process, it means you've also got a faulty product. Yeah. So we have two types of miscarriage. We got the right guys the first time, and they've been let off through due process. Yes. Right? That is, process is really important. Or we got, you know, the wrong guys, and we're looking for someone new. They tend to be the false confession-y ones. Yeah. Now, process and product. PACE came in. Safeguard 1, transparency. So underpinning PACE, you've got two ethoses. Anyway, okay, which is all about transparency and fairness in the process. Transparency, massive thing, mandatory recording of police interviews. Yes. Key. And you'll be surprised around the globe how many countries still do not. That was obviously with our suspect interviews. We still do not do that with our witness interviews, guys. So either in 2018, we still do not record every single witness.
Are there plans to do that?
We've been changing it. I gave a keynote in Leicester recently, and someone said to me, you've got 15 years left of your career, Becky. And I okay, someone's looked me up. I thought I was longer than that. What would you change? If you could only change one thing, and it would be the police handwritten statement. Yeah. Blight and justice, thing of the past. There are more and more of our witnesses we do record, and some of them we can even play as evidence in chief from the Youth Justice Criminal Evidence Act for our vulnerable groups. Yeah. And now with technology, another of our fit factors, with body worn, can we utilise that to help use body worn instead of our interviews? Yeah. Handwritten wise to record it, because memory's so abysmal. Yes. So we can't rely on a police officer. You know, I've done a lot of work recently on some of the terror attacks, and how do we gather information at a dynamic scene, loads going on, shots going, people, you know, trauma, massive go. You know, it's your brain. You've only got so many cognitive resources. You fight. You know, you fright. Then you're also trying to deal with walking wounded and trying to get information to feed back to our counter-terrorist hubs to make sure we get the right guys. That's a difficult process. Yeah. And we're there writing statements. Come on, guys. Is there a better way? So
technology can help. Then.
I think so. One area of my research will be looking at that specific one problem, actually, in the next year and a half, through the CREST research that I'm part of.
Okay, brilliant. Where are we on our fit factors?
So we have leadership, miscarriages. Number 2, legislation and the safeguards. So PACE, the main one with that for me for interviewing was recording. Yeah. Obviously we got time in it, legal advice in that. Yeah. We've also got a golden thread is vulnerability. Yeah. From all our miscarriages, if you do it, there is a golden thread of vulnerability. So we have the appropriate adult. Now the demise of the appropriate adult. In the 1980s, it worked to have someone living and breathing and sitting in the room. Now we're a bit more technical in our interview room. So I think the appropriate adult will disappear in the future. Yeah. Because we've got the intermediary for the witness. One thing we are better at with the witness, hooray, is an intermediary who's employed by the Ministry of Justice, most of them speech and language therapists. They are employed to look at communication and, you know, and to try and tailor that interview for the particular vulnerability. Someone who's been on, you know, love them, a lot of them are white, middle class. When we did the review of appropriate adults, of women, you know, obviously doing it for a wonderful reason, but they're not speech and language therapists. They haven't got that expertise. Yeah.
So it's a professionalisation of that area of
it's very difficult because we've got obviously the PACE clock, 24 hours. With intermediaries, we don't have that PACE clock. So, yeah, so in the future, that's something that also we're looking at, is can we have something slightly better now, something more on the intermediary line, but obviously with the PACE clock.
Yeah, absolutely.
So fit factor 2, legislation. Yeah. 3 is invested mindset. We got rid of the term interrogation in Britain. Yeah, and it's all about being an investigator. So now witnesses become important. Forensic evidence over the years obviously has been far more important. So we had to train police officers to actually investigate too, rather than just getting a cough. So it's having that investigative, cognitive mindset. So when I go to certain countries, they've still got to think about it. It's not just getting a confession. Yeah. Confession is not, as Devlin said, a shortcut to justice. Indeed. All those moons ago.
Number 5?
I'm at 3. So, right, framework. Here we go. I know. That's why I've got them down here. I know. Okay. So we've got miscarriages, leadership. We have got legislation,
Yes.
cognitive mindset,
Yes.
training regime.
Yes.
How long does it take to train a police officer to interview?
Mm.
We went from 1 week, and now I created for the British police, and it's gone to other countries with Colin Clark, the tiered approach to interview
yes.
training. We need to train police officers a drip-fed approach of different skills over time.
Yeah.
The training regime is really important. There's lots of research on that. It has to be immersive, small numbers, with lots of practice.
Because
There's-
it's not innate.
Because it's not innate.
Okay, next one.
Okay, well, part of it might be.
Okay.
Because with the tiers, we can get everyone to tier 2,
Yeah.
but some people will never get tier 3. We're not all advanced drivers.
Yes.
So some people fail. Some people in my class for tier 3, advanced interviewing or PIP level 2 specialist guys, could be in there for 20 years and they'll never become advanced.
Okay.
So you've got to have, that's another one,
Yeah.
ability of officer.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, it's underpinned by technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really key. And also the knowledge of the police officers. What knowledge should they have? And we started realising they needed memory, communication skills, the law they can do
Yes.
to learn on a distance
Yes.
learning type of thing. But it's the memory, the knowledge.
Yeah.
Final one,
Yeah.
quality assurance.
Yes.
There's something called the skills fade curve.
Mm.
And this is how I explain it. Would you like, you're about to have heart surgery next
Yeah.
week, you're not, but just in
Yes.
case. Right, would you like a surgeon who hasn't done one for a year?
Possibly not.
No. So how do you keep surgeon skills
Yes.
up?
Yeah.
So we've been looking at the medical literature to see how they keep their skills. And it's basically practice. So we do the same with police now. This is how do we combat the skills fade curve, which goes after about 3 months. So if a police officer hasn't done an interview in 3 months or an advanced one, the skills start fading.
So is that about continuing learning, or is that about practice, or is it about both?
Bit of both.
Okay.
Bit of both. Bit of refreshing to get, because how we use everyday conversation, is turn taking. We use closed questions, leading questions. So we have to teach police officers to interview and communicate in a very different way, which is against everyday conversational skills. Also, we've got to then come up with techniques to get police officers to use the general public to counter their everyday conversational skills really quickly. So that's what we've been doing for 20 years, getting ways of how we can get police officers to speak differently versus then creating techniques that they can use to get witnesses and victims and suspects to counter. Thing is detail. When you say to someone, do you have a good holiday?
Yeah.
We don't want the detail, do we?
Yes. Yeah.
But in a police interview, we want that detail.
Yeah.
So how do we stop people, using what we call maximum quantity rule? That detail is not required.
Yeah.
Very difficult.
And that's all part of the training.
Part of the training, part of the techniques, something called the demo technique that we're trialling in a lab at the moment.
Yeah. Brilliant. And hopefully all of this contributes to fewer miscarriage of justice cases in the future.
Get the right guys for the job.
Because it is all, I mean, most of the evidence suggests that it's human error, isn't it, in miscarriages?
As psychologists, what we're trying to do is minimise the preventable error.
Yeah.
Exactly, Sarah. It's trying to get it narrower and narrower and narrower. So when we've got a miscarriage, we look at what's gone wrong. Is there anything preventable, preventable error we call it, don't we? And then we're trying to minimise it by using techniques. So it's not about going, Dave's got it wrong.
Yes.
It's not about individual. This is about how we can change the system to make it easier for the police officers to do their jobs and the investigators, and to make sure, that we've got the best evidence, to be able to sort of convict the right people.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Becky.
My pleasure.
That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that session. We also hope you enjoyed the session earlier between myself and Gordon, where we discussed writing better essays. Now, once you start to hopefully see those marks improving, the next logical step is, how can I do even better? Now, what's coming up for you now is a conversation between myself and Steve Savage, where we considered how to move from good to excellent in your writing. If you're new or relatively new to ICJS, don't be alarmed by any of this advice. It's something to consider a little further down the line of your studies. But if you're at level 5 and most especially level 6 students, do watch and hopefully take away some useful... Hello, and we're joined now by Professor Steve Savage on the sofa from ICJS, and we're going to be talking a little bit about increasing your marks as much as you can and moving a little bit more from good or very good up to excellent or even very excellent. So we're going to be talking through some tips and ideas on how you can improve those essays at the higher level if possible. So welcome, Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to start off by thinking about the types of students that you're targeting here. You do some sessions for us already on moving from very good to excellent in assignments. Who is the target group for that advice, and why do you think it's important?
Well, firstly, I should say that the observations I'll make apply to all students. It's about writing good quality work, and so that applies to all students. But I'm particularly targeting students who hit consistently good marks, very good marks, let's say 66, 67, 68, who are concerned that they can't make that step into the 70s into first class honours work. So it's those people that are on the cusp, and they often come to me and say, I just can't break through. So there's a focus there. Also, students that maybe just creep into the 70s but don't get much higher than that. So it's about even moving from the excellent to the very excellent. So they're the people I'm focusing on. And the observations relate to my own years of experience as a marker, far too many years of experience as a marker, but also my experiences as an external examiner, because all degrees, as you know, have external examiners, and so I've been around the country looking at student work and markers' comments on students' work, so it's drawing on that experience. So it's an insight into the mind, the murky mind of the marker in many respects.
Yes. Brilliant. And we should probably say that getting marks of that level, sort of 70 and above, is quite rare. I mean, these are really, really good pieces of work, aren't they? And if students, particularly at level 4, are hitting marks in the sort of early to mid-50s, as we would expect at level 4, this is not to alarm them at all. We would expect marks to be much lower when students first start and eventually start to creep up.
Absolutely. So this is about just moving from one stage to the other. So it does apply equally to other levels of student performance.
Brilliant. Okay. So, is the advice that you're going to be sharing with us today, is this about writing the assignment? Is it about writing it up?
It is, to a great extent, but I'd like to talk about the series of stages or sequences that are involved in producing a piece of work, and in this case a piece of high quality work.
Okay.
So, it takes us from selecting a topic, because that is more important than people often think. It takes us through researching the topic, and doing the background work and how critical that is, and some do's and don'ts there. Then on to the planning process, how you plan your work before you write up, and then finally on to that writing the piece of coursework or the dissertation. So I should say that what I say does apply to dissertations as well, in slightly different ways, and I'll comment on that.
Oh, okay, that's good. That gives us something to get our teeth into. So why don't we start with that first one you mentioned then, selecting your topic? What's the advice there?
Well, it's about doing homework, and a really good piece of coursework often reflects the fact that the student is very interested in it, even fired up by that topic. So choosing a topic that you are committed to, find very interesting, can actually help you produce a quality piece of work. Now, there is a warning there that sometimes if you feel too passionate about that piece of work, then you may not provide the sort of balance that one would expect of a good quality piece of work. And by balance, I don't mean you sit on the fence, it just means that you give equal hearing to the opposition. So let's say if you feel very strongly about capital punishment, and there's an essay title there about discuss capital punishment, by all means be as passionate as you wish about it, but make sure that you don't give insufficient balance to alternative points of view.
Yeah.
Where you have you're not sure about a choice of a topic, let's say from an essay list, it's not a bad idea to actually read maybe one article on one or two or three topics to find which one you feel most comfortable with. But of course you also have the distance learning materials which give good guidance as well.
So it's about reading the questions carefully, breaking them down a little bit, doing a little bit of background work to find out a bit about what the area is about, and then deciding which question you want to focus on. And what I often say to students is pick something that really interests you. You know, don't pick. Sometimes I think people try and pick questions because they think, oh, I can get a good mark from that question, but it's got to be something that interests you, not necessarily fires you up, but something that you've got a general level of interest in.
Something that you can talk at length about and with some passion, if possible. Not in every case, obviously. So the other thing to take into account is whether there is an available literature. Now, if we provide If we provide a list of essay titles, we wouldn't do that if there wasn't a substantial literature to fall back on. With the dissertation, however, it's rather different because you select the topic, you design the topic, so you want to make sure that your choice of dissertation, which carries such a weight on the degree, is one in which there is a sufficient literature to fall back on. So
and not just organisational literature, but also some academic literature as well.
Academic literature,
yeah, absolutely.
Because that is about the depth of understanding. But you will get advice on that selection from tutors.
Yeah. So the second one was then going on to researching your topic.
Yeah, because an excellent piece of work is one which shows thorough, extensive research and reading. And you have to put the hours in to get first-class marks, I'm afraid. So it's about how you go about that. What I'd suggest is that before you start, you take the title that you're working on, you break it down into its constituent parts and think what's involved here, read around each of them so that you know that you're answering all of the question. So I always think about the oath you take when you're on the witness box. I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's like I promise to answer the whole question and nothing but the question. And so that stage in the proceedings is a really important one. Break the question down, then you start reading around each of them. I'd also say a little hint is that if possible, try and find the most recent reference you can on that area. One that the marker may not have seen themselves, and there's nothing more impressive than that when you're reading something. And it is about raising eyebrows, and you know, Charman 2018. You know, it comes to mind.
Yeah.
But the other thing about the most recent text is they will have the most recent up-to-date list of references. So snowball referencing, pick those up. So that sort of research. But there's nothing that influences a marker more than somebody that's gone out there and found their own stuff.
Absolutely. Good. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And then the third is planning your coursework.
Yes. And again, a crucial phase in the process. And this is about structure and content. And I always recommend, as many colleagues do, that you have a two-stage approach to planning. Like we do when we do a lecture, we start off with an outline and then we flesh it out. So start off with a skeleton plan with 4 or 5 headings: introduction, different topics, followed by conclusion. Then you make sure that answers the question and the whole question. And then you move to a more elaborate plan where you start to fill in sub elements of those sections, and then start to put your references in and your sources and your quotations. So that's a really important part of the process. It's about guaranteeing structure and going back to it, and I keep saying it, answering the question and the whole question.
And that structure as well needs to be logical and chronological. If that's suitable. Brilliant. Okay, and then the last stage is writing it up.
Yes, that's that small thing. And again, think about it in terms of the constituent elements that you've set out in your plan, but your introduction is so powerful, and if you grab the reader, the marker in this case, with the introduction, it has a very powerful effect on the rest of the marking process. So, you know, it's maybe refer to a very recent event, but again, you're showing initiative, you're showing interest, that isn't always possible depending on the topic. Then talk about the question. In the introduction, talk about the question, and then say how you're going to deal with it, and we call this signposting. So good signposting, the marker then think, this person knows what they're doing, and hopefully you can maintain that level throughout. So that's the introduction, very important. The main body of the text, of course, is critical, and that is, again, that's about structure and flow. Make sure that it is following the sequence of the question as set, and also that there's a relationship between the different parts. So I've done this and now I'm doing that. Tell the reader where you're going. And so structure and flow. High quality marks, excellent marks, nearly always involve a heavy peppering of sources and references. You are expected to show extensive reading, and you know that's why the term pepper is great. I think it just captures it. If you've got one reference, see if you can put 2 in. If you've got 2, see if you can put 3 in. Obviously you've got your word limit, but just litter
Yes.
your work with references.
And students will often say, won't they, well, how many sources do I need to write an essay? And I always try and say, it's not, there's not a number here,
No.
but I do quite like the expression theoretical saturation, which is when you keep reading and reading and reading, and you start to read the same thing over and over again, and then you realise, I've covered this. I've
Yeah.
read so much now that I've covered all of the main points and the main issues, and now I can take it and start constructing my essay.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you said writing up stage are the small part of it, and you said jokingly, but actually, those first three stages do take some considerable time, don't they? And
Absolutely.
and time's got to be committed to those.
And one other small point, going back to what I said earlier, nearly done, is that do try and avoid saying cited in. If you're referring to somebody cited in, the marker's thinking, well, why didn't you read the original? Now, sometimes, if it's a 19th century text that's impossible to get out, that's okay.
Yeah.
Very sparingly cited in. But again, try and avoid, if you can, cited in a textbook.
Absolutely. Because if it's important enough to be in your essay, it's important enough that you go and try and find it.
And then on to the conclusion.
Yes.
Let's not forget the conclusion.
No, absolutely.
Don't let the essay fizzle out.
Yes.
Go out with a bang, where you go back to the question, explain how you've dealt with it, and then come out with a message.
Absolutely.
And then even go off-piste, as we say, be a bit speculative right at the end about the future if it's policy related. So, leave the marker thinking, wow.
Yes. So create an impression with your introduction,
Yeah.
and then have that bit of a wow factor in your conclusion, if possible.
All linked together with a nice structure.
So what are students doing if they miss out? What if they're not getting those top marks? What are they tending not to do?
Well, I've got a list here of things that I've seen from what markers have commented on in terms of, because sometimes it is a marginal thing, if only you'd done this, or if only you hadn't done this. So in terms of what you try and avoid, you must avoid for this level of marks, is slip-ups in presentational style, typos, missing references. You're not going to get high-class marks, first-class marks with presentation slip-ups. Needs to be a good piece. Well written. Yeah. Failure to answer the whole question. You did really well on this part of it, it's just unfortunately you didn't cover it all. It doesn't mean to say it's got to be 50-50, whatever, but you just got to answer the whole question. Over-reliance on one or two authors at times. Sometimes that happens periodically, that you're seeing, this student is following this particular author on all of these points. Try and mix it up a bit so that you don't look as if you're relying too much on one author. Obviously, some of the authors are leaders in their field, so if you're dealing with someone like Albert Cohen, you will spend some time on Albert Cohen in terms of subculture theory, but don't over-rely on one or two authors overall or periodically. Over-reliance on non-academic sources, again, this is a common comment on work that hasn't quite made it. Too much website citation, not enough articles and books based on research. So that's another one. Fizzles out at the end, as I said. That often happens actually. It's almost as if they run out of steam, and that's a great shame because they've done all of that great work. Sometimes it's about failure to explain some of the key concepts that because quite often the student understandably thinks that the marker's going to understand what this is about, but don't think like that. Show that you understand it, and so sometimes failure to deal with a particular concept or theory, you've moved on.
Yeah.
And then finally, overuse of quotations, as I said.
Okay. In a sentence, how would you summarise getting from good to excellent?
Right. I've got some keywords again. Just polish. Structure, so important. Flow, clarity. Command and authority, show that you're on top of this field, and that impresses the marker. Heavily sourced, peppered. Degree of innovation, enterprise. It doesn't have to be an original piece of work by any means, but show enterprise, show initiative. Go off piste a little bit every now and then, as long as you stay with the question, and above all, make sure that you've made a strong conclusion. Yeah. So.
Leave a lasting impression. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. That's been very
Pleasure.
useful. I hope that's been useful for you as well. And we're looking forward to seeing some fabulously excellent essays being submitted soon. Welcome back. Now, in a rather strange shift from our last live session with Becky Milne, when we were talking about investigators and the skills required to be a good interviewer, we're now doing something quite different, quite radically different. in case. We are now looking at radical criminology, and I'm joined on the sofa by Mark Jacobs, and we're going to be looking at radical criminology and its emergence and who is involved in it all. And that's something that's covered in all of your units, Mark, is that right?
That's right, Sarah, yeah. Radical criminology component in each of the 3 theoretical units which are studied by crime and criminology students. At level 1 in understanding criminology, there's a section on radical criminology and conflict criminology, and there's something you might want to talk to me about later in relation to what's the difference between those 2 terms. And in the issues in criminology, that's primarily about radical criminology.
Great.
And it too looks at different variants of radical criminology, but it's primarily about the kind of that kind of way of thinking in terms of radical criminology. And at level 3, we had
level 6.
Oh, sorry, level 6, the old language. Level 6, in a unit called Contemporary Criminologies,
Yeah.
there's a section in there, and it's not called radical criminology. It's contemporary critical criminology.
Okay.
So already I've thrown a different number of terms at you, but
Yeah.
they all refer to this notion of radical criminology.
So it's interspersed across level 4, 5, 6. So for all of our students, this should be really important.
It will indeed.
So therefore, can you briefly explain to us what radical criminology is?
Yeah, I'll try and be as brief as I can here, but essentially radical criminology is oppositional.
Yes.
It's oppositional in terms of both mainstream conventional criminology. It's also oppositional in terms of the mainstream norms in society. And in being oppositional, it's also very much politically left-wing.
Okay.
And in terms of being political left-wing, we span the spectrum from being kind of radical, more extreme, to being more sort of centre of the road, sort of more liberal. But all of these ideas that we're going to talk about today are kind of politically on the left hand.
I mean, it's just more political, full stop, isn't it? If you think when we last did this interview on the sofa, we were looking at positivism and classicism. Would you say that politics played a big part in those theories?
No, certainly not with regards to positivism, because what they try and convey is that they are neutral, and what positivism is primarily is about being scientific,
Yes.
and science is about being objective,
Yeah.
or being dispassionate. What radical criminology is very much concerned with is being passionate.
Yes.
So
So no neutrality.
no
here.
neutrality. So it's
Okay.
quite right.
So where did it emerge from? Why did it emerge?
Well, where and why? Good questions, because it emerged predominantly in the 1970s. And in terms of British criminology, which was kind of the most exciting period of criminology and development of British criminology particularly, it was in the 1970s. But I don't want students to think that there was no kind of prehistory, because actually there are, one of the first pioneers of radical or Marxist criminology is a Dutch criminologist called Willem Bonger, Bonger,
Okay.
and he produced his work in 1916. And there are other theories who also produced work before the 1970s. So you could ask yourself, well, why aren't we talking about that earlier period? Well, the reason why radical criminology became particularly popular in the 1970s was it was a period of questioning, a period of great kind of social movements, social agitation, the emergence of new youth cultures, emergence of new countercultures, alternative ways of life. So these kind of ideas that may have existed before gained real appeal and real interest.
Because of that radical change that was going on within society.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't just going on in the corridors of power, wasn't just going on in ivory towers, it was actually part of a movement that was going on countrywide.
Absolutely, and you can link that into with the expansion of higher education as well, because this is radical students and radicalised citizens that became very kind of motivated, incentivised and politicised, and they began sort of being drawn towards these questions about who has power, who creates criminality, who creates identities around deviance and so on and so forth. So it was a period of just questioning the status quo, questioning academic conventional mainstream thinking, questioning the establishment, and actually what's a period of actually recognising that there's a period of diversity, a period in which people live lives of very different alternative ways. And what we had with, like you mentioned earlier about positivism, is what positivism tends to suggest, and positivism fits quite nicely, and I'll use a horrible phrase here, under kind of a functionalist idea. That with the right forms of knowledge, we can produce a society that is harmonious, that is orderly, that is passive, that works efficiently. Now the problems with that, and some of the theories that relate to that, and you can also throw in there control theory, is actually society is riven with inequalities.
Yeah.
And so what we begin to talk about radical criminology, it begins to expose and discuss and think about different levels of inequalities.
And so power then becomes quite a crucial aspect.
Absolutely, absolutely. So power is a crucial aspect of analysis here. Because what we're beginning to do here with radical criminology, because it's oppositional, it requires us to dig deeper. It requires us to dig beneath the surface of things. So you asked me earlier about positivism, the relevance of positivism. They never question what is crime. So what radical criminologists begin to do is problematise or think critically about why is this form of behaviour a crime? How has it become so? And why are other forms of behaviour which are equally, if not more harmful, not considered criminality? So they begin to question everything. And so one of the key themes about this is just challenging, he's being sceptical, he's questioning things. But in doing so, it creates a great deal of sort of disharmony, and recognising that the world, or the social world, is one which is riven with inequalities and power inequalities.
So rather than taking crime as the starting point and then looking at what might cause it and how we might solve it, it actually takes a step back to say, first of all, we need to understand what crime is.
Absolutely.
And it has a bigger definition, I suppose, than traditional accounts of what crime might be.
Indeed. I like that idea, your notion about stepping back. That's exactly what it does. It steps back, it begins to look at, if we think about criminology more broadly, it begins to look at the conceptual language, so crime, offences, and begins to look at also the architecture, if you like, of the criminal justice system. Asking about questions about the police, asking questions about the formation of law, asking about questions about punishment. So it's very much stepping back. And so this idea of stepping back fits in nicely with what radical criminology does do, is provides what are called grand theories, or macro theories. So you think about going back to, you mentioned about positivism before, what positivism does, it provides sort of very micro theories. The focus of attention is the individual.
Yes.
Okay, so you're looking, if you take Lombroso's work, he does anatomical measurements of the physical features of an individual, very refined individual sort of measurements. Standing back, what we're doing is looking at social norms and looking at social structures. And again, you mentioned earlier about power. So what they begin to do is offer sort of grand theories, or what's called macro theories, and understand this kind of structural or power inequalities which affect our everyday lives.
So there's a big difference then between radical criminology and other types of criminology.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier about what is radical criminology. What we're beginning to see also, radical criminology is critical of those earlier or mainstream thinking in criminology. So it's a breakaway. A breakaway from what was the standard kind of thinking in criminology, because it began to question, well, again, what is crime? And so it became very, very critical of positivism and its supposed neutrality. Because under this supposed neutrality was actually the imposition of multiple forms of inequality, because you're not looking at power inequalities.
So if the focus for radical criminology isn't so much on the individual, how do radical criminologists explain offending?
Interesting question. Positivists argued that offending could be associated with particular types of people.
Yes.
And again, going back to Lombroso, who most students are familiar with, he talks about the born criminal.
Yes.
And you can differentiate the born criminal because of physical characteristics, according to Lombroso. And so he begins to set up a kind of a narrative between where you've got normal law-abiding people and criminals who can be identified by their physical characteristics. What radical criminologists actually begin to say is that we are all potentially criminals. We are all potentially criminals. It's nothing that necessarily differentiates the criminal from the non-criminal. But they explain criminality quite differently. Much of what they talk about is, well, why is it that most of us think about criminality being perpetrated by the lower orders of society? And so what they begin to argue is actually the lower forms, they do say that people without power commit crime. But they explain in two ways generally. And criminality is explained by one notion, which is absolute poverty. So people commit crime because they are destitute. Or another phrase that you could talk is they're dispossessed. And so they're almost forced into criminality because of the absence of material, economic wealth. And so the explanation there is about, again, you're not looking at the individual, you're looking more broadly at social inequalities in this relation. It's about poverty. But they also explain some other types of criminality, which may not be about trying to get material wealth or food, but some other forms of criminality in terms of rebellion, or revolt, or resistance. And that's an interesting way of thinking, because if you think about what's happening now with this very, very much sort of social media and the kind of rebellion about the Me Too campaign, so about sexual inequality, sexual harassment, there's another level of kind of like civil disobedience. So going back historically, you would see some sort of lower class people sort of rebelling against being dispossessed of their land, or being dispossessed of their traditional ways of living. If you go back historically from a Marxist point of view, you know, land was open. People were able to graze their cattle, build their homesteads. They were relatively self-sufficient. But as you moved into capitalism, land became a possession. And it became possession often of landed gentry. And suddenly, those traditional ways of life were dispossessed of it. You were forced into becoming a labourer rather than self-sufficient. So going back to your question, criminality is explained for lower orders as a form of trying to sort of supplement their impoverished conditions, or on the other hand, as some level of revolt or rebellion. But I don't want to chip in yet, because it's also, as I mentioned the first thing, that crime happens throughout the class structure. Because they also explain criminality of the powerful. And if we go back to Bonga referred to this idea of egoism. And essentially capitalism, according to radical Marxist criminologists, is inherently criminogenic. And what this extension of egoism is the wealthy or powerful people commit crime because they are self-interested. They want to accumulate more and more economic power, political power, or cultural power. Again, I'm thinking here in terms of Harvey Weinstein more recently. You know, he had most of those things, but in terms of what Harvey Weinstein was able to do, you know, his professional prestige, he was able to sort of exert his power upon, you know, early career female actresses.
Or looking at banking collapse.
Absolutely.
But I'm interested there that you just want to go back to, you talk about revolution and rebellion. I mean, Marx talked about these issues, but also talked about the fact that eventually people would rise up and overthrow the capitalist state. I mean, we haven't seen that just yet.
You're quite right. And actually, this is something that radical criminologists had to kind of contend with, because, as you quite rightly say, what Marx predicted was that the working or lower orders of society would become more politically conscious as to their own exploited, unequal position, and would rise up in revolt. And again, that's if we go back to my earlier point about forms of criminality. These forms of criminality are kind of regarded as proto-revolutionary. They are resistant, they are challenging the system. But that, as you quite rightly mentioned, in capitalist or Western societies, this revolution hasn't occurred. And ironically, where it has occurred is in former Eastern European countries, which did have a more communist or socialist regime, which raises some interesting questions. And this is where we have a shift from kind of Marxist thinking to maybe neo-Marxist or critical criminology. And a word I'm going to throw out at you is a horrible word, which was coined by an Italian neo-Marxist called Gramsci, was hegemony, or hegemony.
Which no one ever knows.
No, you just have to be confident when you talk about these terms, and everyone thinks, yeah, that's hey. So hegemony. And essentially what hegemony refers to is all of those people that might have potentially revolted lose their kind of like politicised nature. They become kind of subordinate into the system that they're in. They actually begin to buy into it. And I see students today, and I ask them, how many of you students have been out on a political protest? And they look at me like mad. And I say, well, why don't you go out on political protest? Well, essentially, the argument is that we all have a vested interest in the status quo remaining. As I look at students, they've got their laptops, their smartphones, their design, some have got designer clothing. So hegemony is this idea that we begin to succumb to the norms of society. And so it therefore dilutes, diminishes any real political agitation. But as I say, there's pockets of agitation that we are seeing now in the social media in regards to sexism, the Black Lives Matters kind of campaign. There's also been various campaigns around sort of making multinational corporations pay their taxes more fairly, and also how offshore tax avoidance. So that although there isn't maybe any huge global movements in the capitalist kind of West, there are various pockets of social movements. Another example just to throw at you, is what's happened in America and young people who are now campaigning for reforms around guns.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, you know, they are challenging the system which before that had been accepted as a norm.
Yeah.
So that there is pockets of kind of challenging the hegemonic control.
Okay. Now I want to pick you up on something that you've been saying. We have entitled this session Radical Criminology, but I've already heard you talking about Marxist criminology. I've already heard you mention critical criminology. Now this is something that students get quite confused about. What's the difference?
Great that you asked me this. And again, you mentioned before I mentioned you've just got to be confident. And I just say this is how I interpret the different variants of radical criminology.
Okay.
So radical criminology first, let's just understand it as a generic descriptive term.
Yeah.
And under radical criminology, there's a whole series of different variants, and they're all kind of placed differently in terms of political kind of spectrum. So you've got the sociologists of deviance in the 1970s, who are relatively kind of centre the road, relatively liberal. Then you've got the Marxist criminologists, who are at the other end.
Yes.
And what Marxist criminologists, I differentiate Marxist criminologists because what they do is they generally kind of, it's a more of a dogmatic acceptance of Marxist political theory. But what they do, and then they very much engage in this kind of grand theorising, using it to expose the kind of economic inequalities and power inequalities. But what Marxist criminologists, and the book, the most seminal foundational book here, which I'm having in mind, is a book published in 1973 called The New Criminology by Taylor, Walton and Young. Now read through the book. It's a wonderful book because it criticises all of the standard conventional criminological modes of thought at the time, but goes through it with a fine-tooth comb and discrediting it and exposing the shortcomings and flaws. But what it never does in that book is actually engage in any empirical research. So I mentioned before critical criminology. What critical criminologists do, and I think this differentiates them from Marxist criminologists, they actually go out and do empirical work. The empirical work might involve analysis of media portrayals. In 1978, there was a famous book called Policing the Crisis around the moral panic of the young black mugger. And what they did is they went to talk about to the young black mugger. So there was interviews. So they engaged in some form of field work. They did interviews with the young black mugger. They analysed the media portrayals. They analysed the kind of the rhetoric from politicians and kind of influential spokespeople. So there's a difference between Marxist criminology, because one is grand theory, and it's theory alone, but and relatively aloof and detached. Whereas critical criminology is very much involved in doing empirical work and also very much involved in grassroots activism. So a lot of critical criminologists in the 1970s were involved in penal abolition. A lot of them were involved with feminist activism. A lot of them were involved with critical race theory and activism around racism. And to this day they're involved still with a whole raft of different pressure groups and civil movements trying to sort of create change.
So activism is a big part of
activism, and again, the new criminology, Marxist criminology, was criticised for pointing to a new social order, but never explaining how we get there. Critical criminologists talk about things like true democracy, true transparency, true justice, social justice, and they talk about how we achieve a different social transformation, where Grenfell Tower, those kind of debates and the inequalities shouldn't have ever happened if people were more concerned with social justice rather than criminal justice and being punitive. So there's critical criminology and Marxist criminology. I mentioned earlier conflict criminology. Conflict criminology, I think, is predominantly American. And it was produced by a number of American radical criminologists, Richard Quinney, Chambliss, Turk, Selin, and others. But they had to stray a very careful road because they were writing work at the time of McCarthyism. And McCarthyism, Senator McCarthy, it was witch hunts for anyone that was sympathetic with communism. It was a time of the Cold War, which interestingly seemed to be revived again between Trump and Putin, and the escalation of war and military. In the 1950s and that sort of period, these academics wouldn't want to kind of jeopardise their academic credibility by being labelled, an interesting word there, labelled a kind of a socialist or communist sympathiser. So what they did discuss more fully is kind of like expose the kind of conflicts and inequalities in society. And another film I always get students to think about, should they have watched it, is Forrest Gump. Because that's kind of a recent contemporary history of American culture and the civil rights movements, the anti-Vietnam campaigns, and beginning to question the status quo. So conflict they begin to emerge and begin to paint a picture of society not based on consensus, as control theorists would have us believe, but a society which is riven with class inequality, power inequality, female inequality, sexual, and the list goes on.
Thank you so much, Mark. We could talk for hours about
could.
this. This is really interesting. But if anything, it's given students something to watch over the weekend in the snow, which is Forrest Gump. So thank you so much. That was really, really helpful, and particularly to understand those differences between the different terms that are involved within the umbrella of radical criminology. So thank you very much indeed. Now we move on to a session now that will be useful for those students who are considering using a survey or questionnaire as part of their dissertation research, or perhaps in their work towards their research methods unit. Here, with a little help from Joe, I consider how to write a better survey and how to avoid a poorly designed survey. Surveys are a great way to gather data for your research projects and can be relatively straightforward and cheap to do. This is especially the case now that surveys can be created, distributed and analysed online. Here at the University of Portsmouth, we can provide you with access to our recommended survey tool, which is Bristol Online Surveys. It's free for you to use, allows multiple questions, protects the respondent's anonymity and is fairly intuitive to use. This all sounds very easy so far, except there's a problem with using surveys for your research needs, and that problem is a poorly designed survey. I've looked at hundreds of proposed surveys from students over the years, and with the exception of a few, similar problems emerge in almost all of them. So the plan for today's short presentation on online surveys is to tackle some of those problems and to help you to create an online survey which is clear, precise and actually asks the questions that you are seeking answers to. There are many important issues to consider before you get to the stage of designing your survey, such as sampling, population and coverage. I haven't got the space to talk about those today, but look at your relevant unit sites for more information on these issues. You should also ensure that you've considered carefully what the issues are to be investigated and that you're basing this on your thorough reading of the relevant literature. You can't start planning a survey about people's perceptions of sentencing leniency, for example, until you're fully aware of what the issues are with that particular topic. So, on to question design. What's wrong with this question?
What was the reason you last saw a doctor?
Whose doctor? A medical doctor, an academic doctor, you might have seen a doctor on the TV, at a party, in the street. This question suffers with a lack of clarity and doesn't offer any alternatives, although that's not necessarily essential. Let's try again.
What was the medical problem or reason for which you most recently went to your GP?
There's two choices there, a medical problem or a reason. Also, what time period does most recently cover? Memories are limited. It may have been years ago. What research shows is that our recall of GP attendance is around 4 weeks. So, here are 5 examples of types of questions to avoid. Number 1, asking more than one question at a time.
Was the website clear and interesting?
Well, what if it was clear and not interesting? Number 2, question and answer category mismatch.
Are you happy with the number of police officers patrolling in your area? A, very satisfied, B, satisfied, C, dissatisfied, D, very dissatisfied.
The problem here is that the question asked if you were happy and not whether you were satisfied. That's 2 different emotions. Number 3, questions that make assumptions.
What do you like best about your probation officer?
That presumes that you like something about your probation officer. You may not like anything about them at all. Number 4, double answer categories. This is a very common mistake and usually involves years served or age-related questions. For example,
how long have you served in your current role? 0 to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, 5 to 8 years, more than 8 years.
Now, if I've served for 2 years, then I fit in both the 0 to 2 years category and the 2 to 5 years category. Number 5, agree or disagree questions.
Do you agree that police officers are very hard-working?
Firstly, that's a leading question, but secondly, we have to be aware that respondents are prone to acquiescence bias, which means people tend to agree regardless of views. A better way to phrase this would be, how far do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Police officers are very hard-working, and then have a scale of agreement. So those are 5 types of questions to avoid. Now, I just mentioned there a scale of agreement, and it's to this area which I want to turn to next: frequency and scales. One of the thorny issues of survey design is how many categories to use as answer options. This especially concerns whether or not to use a middle category. So for example, if you're asking how satisfied someone is with something, do you offer 3 options: satisfied, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and dissatisfied, or do you offer 4, 5 or more? Firstly, you need to make a conscious decision about whether to use a middle category or not. Middle categories tend to be don't know, no opinion, neither agree nor disagree, etc. Personally, I prefer not to give my respondents the option of a non-answer. However, there are occasions when you might expect your respondents to actually not know or to actually have no opinion. So you must decide this based upon your question and your knowledge of the topic area. Secondly, you must also allow enough choice, but not too much choice, so that you can understand the variety of opinions that people have. It's not enough to just have satisfied, you really need to know if it's very satisfied or simply satisfied. I would therefore suggest that you choose 4 or 6 categories if you're not using that middle option, or 5 or 7 categories if you are using the middle option. Longer scales do give better measurement, but are tougher for respondents, so bear that in mind. Thirdly, it's also really important that you fully label your scale. That means that each category needs a number or a name. I sometimes see a box containing numbers from 1 to 10 and I'm asked to indicate how much I agree with something. My interpretation of what 7 means in terms of agreement might be very different from someone else's interpretation of what 7 means. So you must fully label your scale. That way people know exactly what they're answering. Now this is an example of a poorly labelled scale, where the respondent would not be clear exactly what 1.5 or 6 actually means. What you can see now is an example of a much better labelled scale, where every potential box is given its own label, so you know exactly what you're ticking. So now that you know a bit more about question design, have a look at this question and see what you think might be wrong with it.
Please tell us what percentage of your day you spend on the internet. A, all of the time, 100%. B, almost all of the time, 90%. C, most of the time, 75%. D, half of the time, 50%. E, some of the time, 25%. F, only a little of the time, 10%. G, none at all, 0%.
So firstly, there's the ambiguity of day. Does that mean a working day or a weekend or either? Does that exclude night? And what time does night begin? Next up's the problem of recall. Remember what I said earlier about this being a problem? The addition of the word normally may help in this question. And the scale is also a bit problematic. There's quite a gap between 25% and 50%. So the general rule of thumb when measuring frequency is the following. First, if it's appropriate, obtain actual numbers. If not, go for number ranges. If not, go for approximate ranges, i.e. every day or once a week. And if that's not appropriate, go for vague quantifiers like often or rarely. And lastly, with this question about internet usage, what does spend actually mean? Is this actively online? What about watching something on a smart TV or listening to music online? Are all devices counted? Here's another one. What's wrong with this one?
Do you think you will continue to stay with your internet provider for the next 2 years, or would you say that you are very likely to look elsewhere? A, stay, B, move.
You probably spotted that there were 2 questions in this, which is very unhelpful to the respondent. They might consider looking elsewhere, but stay with their current provider. Secondly, this is a hypothetical question, so the results are not going to be that interesting, and the time frame is very long. Most people have no idea whether they'll be looking for a new internet provider next month, never mind in 2 years' time. It will probably be more interesting to discover the respondent's motivations in looking elsewhere. And lastly, what is very likely? Without comparison, this is quite difficult to gauge. So hopefully this will have given you some food for thought about how to better design survey questions. I also want to talk to you briefly about designing the survey online. Firstly, let's look at the beginning of your survey. The first page is often one that makes or breaks the survey. Make this welcome page, which is sometimes known as the splash page, visually appealing, with important information such as your statement of purpose, how long it will take to complete the survey, links to more information if necessary, ethical considerations, and how to start the survey. And be precise in your use of terminology. Confidentiality means that I know who you are, but I will not expose the information. Anonymity means that I don't know who you are. If you're asking for contact details at the end of the survey for more information or to request an interview, you cannot make a claim to anonymity. Next, let's consider the survey itself. Avoid complex instructions and keep things simple. But do make sure that all instructions are there for separate questions, e.g. tick all that apply. Use radio buttons, round ones for single choices, and use square boxes if you're asking respondents to provide multiple ticks. Now make the first question easy, interesting, closed and related to the topic. Don't make it about age or gender. It can be quite dull for respondents and off-putting. Avoid respondents having the scroll of death through too many questions on one page. Instead, have one per page. Save sensitive questions until nearer the end. You don't want to potentially alienate your respondent. Leave enough space so that they can answer open-ended questions or consider a small box which can grow. And then should you require an answer? Now, mandatory questions are difficult ethically. No question should be required in a survey as it's a voluntary exercise. But sometimes respondents can miss questions by mistake. So consider an option for questions which is prefer not to answer. And lastly, pilot your survey. Piloting your survey has numerous benefits. It exposes your survey to new forms of thinking and understanding. It means you can evaluate the quality of the answers provided by the survey. This is really important. Do the answers you've been given help in the evaluation of your aim? If they don't, then you've probably been asking the wrong questions and you might need to reconsider your survey. The pilot also helps you to assess and revise the phrasing and content of the questions. And it'll also help you to explore issues of survey structure and question sequence. So this is just an introduction to survey design. I hope it's been useful. Do read more about surveys and questionnaires, and importantly, discuss your proposed questions with your supervisor before you go ahead. One last thing again, don't forget that the University of Portsmouth provides you with access to Bristol online surveys. In order to request access and for an account to be set up for you, please email your request to studentsurveys@port.ac.uk. That's student surveys, all one word, at port.ac.uk. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our second virtual study day of 2018. I have to say this morning it was a little hit and miss whether we would be able to join you or not. We are recording this in a completely deserted building, and you can see that we were in a completely deserted car park this morning as well when we arrived. So I must say a big thank you to the staff behind the camera who made it in this morning to make sure that this could happen. Please do keep posting your pictures of where you're watching the virtual study day onto Facebook, Instagram or Twitter using the hashtag ICJSVSD18, ICJSVSD18, and as I said at the beginning, there will of course be a prize for the loveliest and snowiest picture that you can send in. We will be running more virtual study days in the future, so please do get in touch if you've got ideas of what you'd like us to do, sessions that you'd like us to run, or even members of academic staff that you'd like to see more of. So do let us know and we'll hopefully be able to accommodate those requests in our future virtual study days. But for today, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for joining us again, and we look forward to seeing you again in future days.